a threat occurs when somebody comes along and says something that is true or true in part, which we know to be the case or fear to be the case, and the crowd acts to shut them down precisely because the person is hovering over what they intuit to be the truth.
Yeah. Yes, I could give you a lot of examples of that. I'm very excited today, this evening, to be here with Douglas Murray. Hello, Douglas.
Hello, very good to be with you.
I'm so delighted to be able to speak to you finally. We've been trying to arrange this interview for quite a while. I thought your previous book, The Strange Death of Europe, was a tremendously brave, important book. And so I was really excited when I discovered you'd produced an equally brilliant sequel, The Madness of Crowds. But this time it's all about identity politics, which are topics which are very much my bread and butter. So obviously we're going to talk about The Madness of Crowds tonight. I was just thought it was an extraordinary book full of marvelous stories and very witty and insightful. Douglas, I actually listened to some of it on audiobook and was very pleased to be hearing your dulcet tones. It's always nice when you hear the actual author. I don't know how you managed to do that. Yeah.
Yes, it was great fun actually doing the audiobook for this one. Partly because I get to read out aloud all of the crazy things that I'm otherwise quoting on the page. And I have to say, I did do what actors call corpsing a number of times whilst recording the audiobook, because some of the people I quote say things so ridiculous I couldn't get through them without laughing. And I
can imagine.
I had to keep saying to people in the sound booth, I'm not laughing at my own jokes, I promise.
No.
Ridiculousness.
Well, you do have some wonderful stories in there. Yeah. We were going to talk late last year, and then I got the flu, and we had to cancel. And I've noticed you've done so many interviews since then. I imagine many of my audience is pretty familiar with the major themes of your book. But some of my Australian viewers may not know you. So I thought I might get you to start by explaining what are you talking about with this madness of crowds, this great crowd derangement? What's it all about?
Well, you kindly mentioned the book before this one. I've written 6 books now. And the one before this one, The Strange Death of Europe, was on migration in the 21st century, which is a really difficult subject. Very knotty. It's not just about good and bad and good versus evil. It's about competing virtues and competing visions of the world, which we all have within ourselves as well, apart from anything else. And after I'd finished that book, I didn't want to write about migration thing again for a while. But I did notice that, and had been noticing for some time, that there were other equally difficult issues which were being presented as if they were equally easy, in the same way as, as I say, some people say, it's easy, just open the borders. Or, I was noticing it was the same thing with this, statements being made, particularly about sex and the sexes, which, but a bit about other things as well, including issues to do with race and sexuality, which people were presenting also as if they were just really easy. How dare you not just jump on board with it? And that these were really contested issues, which we were pretending we knew about when we really didn't, for instance.
Yep.
And I'm just a sort of skeptical person on these sorts of things by nature, and I don't like being made to feel stupider than I am, and the age does seem to demand that on a set of sort of social issues. As I say, I particularly noticed it was coming up on everything to do with LGB, everything to do with men and women, relations between the sexes, everything to do with race, and finally, the final chapter on that is everything to do with trans. And I wanted to say, look, a lot of us know this isn't true, that what we're being expected to agree to isn't really true. So let me say out loud on the page or an audiobook how difficult this is, sometimes how much simpler it is than we're making it. And to say what just millions and millions of us just all know is the terrain, because it's not where we've been forced into pretending the terrain is in recent years. So that's what I did. I decided, having gone on one big taboo subject, I decided to go on to one the others. That's the short story.
Yeah, yeah. And what you talk about is how our society, or our, your Britain, of course, and Australia, etc., people are behaving in ways that are increasingly irrational, feverish,
Yeah.
herd-like, and unpleasant. I mean, the
Yeah.
nastiness is
Yes.
something that's really striking, isn't it?
Well, there's an obvious reason for that, which is that
Mm-hmm.
people who think that they are doing good don't have to be nice, because
Yeah,
they've already ticked the nice box by having all the right, good opinions. And I mean, we know from history that you need to think you're acting for the good to act really badly. And and yes, it's. By the way, you mentioned it's anything. Yes, I'm sitting in Britain at the moment. I've been to Australia. I'm
mm-hmm.
going to come back, but I'm very struck by the fact that Australia, Britain, North America have very similar problems on this. We're all at slightly different stages of what I describe as this great derangement, but they're linked. They're very similar.
Yeah,
There's a question there, by the way, why the English-speaking countries have fallen particularly heavily for this. Not to say that other countries haven't, but on continental Europe, for instance, it's not the case that, for instance, Portugal has these massive culture war issues about trans, for instance. It's not the case that relations between the sexes have been made so impossible in France, for instance. I mean, the French-speaking people tend to take the old-fashioned view that men and women have to get on, and they'd rather like them to, I think. This is a different approach.
yeah,
But it is an English-speaking countries thing where it's most feverish. And it is, to put it in its boldest, it is essentially a new religion, a new metaphysical system that we're meant to perceive the world through and live our lives in. And that is to say, we never did have much idea of what we're doing on this earth. Religions have all provided very good totalistic explanations. But in a post-religious age, inevitably people want explanations.
yeah,
And justifications. And the justification for the age that has come up in the last, I'd say, particularly 10 to 15 years is spend your life and find meaning in your life by fighting for the latest rights acquisition that you think should occur. Find a minority that you believe to be oppressed, fight on their behalf, perceive the world as patriarchal, oppressive, racist, particularly your own society, and fight to find meaning. And that means you've got to find people to be enemies. And this is I'm not saying all the people who do this are bad by any means. Some are motivated by, or many are motivated by, a very genuine desire to do good in the world. And I think just a misguided idea. I don't think they're wicked people. I just think they're wrong.
yeah.
But others are undoubtedly using this to pursue what one might describe as a political advantage in the marketplace of ideas.
Absolutely, and the theme that comes up quite a lot in the book is the notion that we're required to pretend to believe in ideas that we know are untrue.
Yes.
And if you stand, I mean, the classic. I've been very involved in the whole issue of the rape crisis, the fake rape crisis, as I call it, the idea that our universities are crawling with rapists.
Right.
And what's fascinating for me is watching how the various countries have developed this campaign. Firstly in America, but in Australia, in America, they set up all these tribunals to adjudicate rape on campus after a lot of advocacy claiming there was this rape problem in the universities. We're going down exactly that route, and I've been out on campuses speaking out about this and getting howled down and having to have the riot squad protecting me and so on. And I've been following what's happening in Britain, and it's exactly the same path. It's just fascinating watching those intercultural, those cross-cultural differences, really.
Well. I mean, people learn from each other, and panics, for instance. I mean, legitimate panics are catching. We know that from all social situations that if one group of people panics about something, another group will hear of it and acquire the same panic themselves. I think it's very interesting, by the way. I'm struck by the number of times I do universities in this book, I cover that quite a lot because a lot of the bad ideas have come from particularly American universities.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm struck by the fact that so much of the discussion around these issues has focused on universities because really universities are or should be, elite institutions, and most people won't go to them. And so there's something very interesting about the fact that we keep focusing on them. And one explanation, I think, is that things discussing the situation on campuses is not just a rarefied but a rather comfortable way for many people in positions of let's use their terms against them, privilege and power, to have some of these discussions. It's much easier to have a discussion about a rape crisis on university campuses than a rape crisis in, for instance, high-rise apartment block buildings owned by the council, which the police don't go near.
Yes.
Because sort of who knows? I don't know anyone who lives there. No way in. There's something revealing about the comparative ease of the locations of the places that people want to locate this discussion.
Mm-hmm. But the lack of logic at the heart of it is just extraordinary. We've never had so many. We've got over 60% of graduates of Australian universities are women. Women lining up to join, to become students and so on. I mean, as if no one believes that there's a rape crisis at our universities, and yet this campaign marches on. It's an amazing thing, really.
Yes, well, and isn't it interesting that there's so much pressure against people who are seen to say precisely that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all ages, I say, all ages have their taboos. All ages have their sacred causes. It's not surprising that there have been times historically when, for instance, to identify a rape crisis somewhere is highly controversial.
Yes.
It is fascinating that we live in an age where to say that such a crisis is not occurring is controversial. Because it means that it implies that an element of the society actually wants the situation to be bad.
Yeah.
And we need to interrogate what's going on there. Why do you want there to be a rape crisis, effectively? Now, I think that in many cases it's quite evident. It's, again, what I referred to earlier, people who want to pursue a political advantage point by using a scenario they can catastrophize around and drawing wider lessons. For instance, the rape crisis on campus isn't just a rape crisis on campus. It demonstrates that we're living in a male-dominated world where men can do anything they want with women's bodies, is the sort of thing you hear. And it's not true.
No, it's not true. I mean, what's interesting to me is because I've been tracing this particular campaign for a long time. I mean, it's actually been very carefully manufactured by feminists who want to adjudicate date rape in a situation where they can get more convictions. So it's been a very calculated campaign, and using lower standards of proof and denying the accused proper legal rights. I mean, it's a very deliberate attempt to what they see as deficiencies in our criminal law system.
Right.
And anyway, so that's only one of the issues. I want to move on to you tell some wonderful stories about tripwires and the idea that these tripwires laid across the culture, and that they're waiting for us to put our foot into it. Yeah, can you talk about that?
Yes, I noticed it for some years, and I give a lot of examples of it. Well, by now you can tell where they are, but the tripwires of the era are seemingly arbitrary to an outsider. We see them in things such as when very prominent people, I'm thinking, for instance, of the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Tim Hunt, makes a joke about relations between men and women in the laboratory, and he makes that rather weak joke. He's not a professional comedian, and even if he were, that wouldn't be a reason for this. But by the time he leaves the conference in South Korea where he's made that joke and lands back in London, he's been fired from every single job he has.
Yeah.
What was the real crime? It was for a man to talk about relations between the sexes
Yeah.
in any way other than the approved way. And the approved way is, particularly for a man, to say that relations between the sexes are simple. That's what. No. You can pretend that it's simple. You can say, for instance, it's easy. Just don't rape women.
Yeah.
That's one. That's one way to survive the era. Calling on my fellow men, stop raping women and babies.
Yeah.
Just stop. That's you survive the era very happily doing that sort of thing. You can say that women are underrepresented. You can say that we need more, etc., etc. You can't joke that actually men and women in the workplace, there are some tensions sometimes because there are people who do fall in love with colleagues, and what do we do about that? Because, by the way, I mean, the reason I mention this as an example of a tripwire is it's a tripwire because it refers to something that deep down we must all know to be at least hovering over an interesting question.
That's right.
The interesting question on this one is, for instance, most workplaces now do have some kind of protocol about dating colleagues and so, or having a sexual relationship with a colleague, and they ignore the fact that still, I can't remember what the stat is this year, but it's a very high stat. Around a fifth of people will meet their life partners in the workplace. Now, if we know we live in a society where and we all know men and women, perhaps in particular, who in the workplace or will say to you outside of work, I wish there were more men at work who are not married or not gay or, better looking or whatever. I wish there was a bigger choice of people in the workplace. Why do people say that? Because particularly if you're a high functioning individual and a highly successful individual, particularly if you're a highly successful woman, you're going to be spending a large amount of your life in the workplace, and it's reasonable that you would hope to meet a mate there rather than on the spare minutes you've got in the evening when you've got home. And so we know this to be the case, and yet the workplace makes it increasingly, not to say difficult, but almost illegal to do the things that we all know are basically exploratory things. I'm not talking here about sex. I'm talking about things like asking people out for a coffee or a drink. And I give some examples in the book of this, but there are people who say it's simple. No means no. That's another one. If you ask somebody out for a coffee and they say no, you've just got to accept it. Well, I can think of a lot of couples who, one pursued the other, and it wasn't. If they'd have given up at the first no, I'd rather not, then it would never have happened, and lots of people wouldn't be on this earth. So my point is, it's more complex than we're pretending on a range of issues, and that's why these tripwires that are laid, which basically invite you, and I think perhaps particularly invite you to, walk over here and let's see if she trips over that one. Yes, bang, we can get her, is effectively what happens. And by now, the tripwires are evident. As I say in the book, they are basically around everything to do with gay, everything to do with men and women, everything to do with race, and everything to do with trans. And there are other taboos in our society, but these have become the big ones, and I think they need identifying, and I think they need more people to be willing to run at them.
Well, yes, you mentioned the brave madman walking straight into the no man's land, fully aware of what they're doing, or mad woman, which is clearly me.
Yes,
and I'm in the middle of this huge furore here, where they're out to deplatform me. But anyway, we don't want to talk too much about that. But I thought that was very amusing, the idea of this brave bad one.
Well, I give examples of such people because there are who have identified, okay, there's a tripwire, I'm going to walk into it, see what happens. I say in the book that one of my self-appointed tasks is to try to make it easier for people to traverse this landscape. I don't want it to be the case that only a few people can talk honestly in a society. I think that it's unhealthy for a society. I think that it's unhealthy for a society to imbibe lies or simplicities and to pretend that we know things we don't know, and pretend not to know things we do know.
That's right. One of the classic areas where you talk about where we're pretending not to know things is to do with sexuality. And I thought it was fascinating over your key groups of women and gay and trans and so on. There was this theme of identity politics trying to desperately to play down sexuality. And the story I really loved was to do with women, and you being you're on a panel speaking at a women means business conference, and everyone else was talking about patriarchy and masculine power, and you very bravely talked about women's sexual power, the power to range men. I love that. Tell me about that.
That it's a very interesting one, this, because I'm struck. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but I'm struck by the way in which, in recent years, in my own adult lifetime, women have increasingly been portrayed as this suffering, weak minority who needs support, but where from it's not exactly clear, because when men do it, they can be blown up themselves.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested in this because, I mean, I grew up in the UK in the 1980s and 90s, and we had a very famous female prime minister, famous head of state in the Queen, and I don't recognize the strange reversal in the depiction of women that has occurred in recent years, and particularly among successful women. And you notice this might again be one of these votive offerings that people are meant to do to the age, where successful women are particularly expected to talk about what they have gone through, or how difficult it has been, or how difficult it is for other women, almost as a sort of Danegeld. To be permitted to remain alive socially in the era. And yes, the conference you referred to, I gave an example, I give it in the book, to say, well, it's true that if we want to play this reductive zero-sum game of interpreting the world as a power struggle between the sexes and individuals, which I think just isn't a fair estimation of the world we live in, or societies we live in. But if we do want to play that, are there forms of power that women have that men do not? Why do we pretend that white patriarchal male boss power is the only power? Do women have powers that men don't? And the answer is yes. Not all, as always, just like not all men have the powers that I just described. But there, I mean, let me give an example. There are two forms of privilege that our society is very, very happy to talk about privilege. There are two forms of privilege we don't actually discuss. One is height. Height is a very big thing in our lives. Arguably, for many people, it's more important than their sex or their sexuality, even. It's jobs you can't do if you're the wrong height. There are people who will not be attracted to you if you're the wrong height. I don't like small men. People say. I used
to be an online dating coach, and I had terrible problems with my women clients who were so prejudiced against shorter men.
Right. I don't want a man who's shorter than me.
Absolutely. I want to look up to him. I just have to work on them over that issue.
So height is a very interesting one, which we don't discuss. And another very interesting one, which was pertinent to the discussion you mentioned, is attractiveness. All studies show, as you know, that very attractive people do disproportionately well throughout the course of their career, essentially whatever their chosen area. And that there is a huge there's a hilarity about the fact that so many of the mores of our time would be being set through and by Hollywood, because of course that's a place of the most privileged people in the world in the looks category, isn't it? But I get it as an example because, of course, I would argue that, I mean, this is not the only form of female power at any rate. And as I say, it's not everyone in the sex that's got it. But is there any equivalent power to the one that an attractive, very smart young woman has when she walks into a room to impress a aging 60-year-old pot-bellied male of the species who is, no, even if he doesn't expect to do anything or couldn't hope to do anything, there is an advantage there. And if the next person coming into the room to pitch happens to be another pot-bellied 60-year-old male of the species, it's possible that the first person has some kind of advantage. Now, but this reveals, by the way, one of the most interesting things in the era, which is our unwillingness to recognize the fact that hierarchies shift all the time.
Yeah.
That, for instance, yes, there are cases. There is a lot of cases we can. There are a lot of cases we can talk about in history of men being in power disproportionately over women, women being held down, undoubtedly. People who are not white being held back because of their race. People who are gay being held back because of their sexuality. We know all of these cases, but one of the things I invite people to do is to think, well, is it possibly the case that goes the other way around as well? And there might be an advantage in certain eras, certain societies, in, for instance, being gay, an advantage in being a perceived minority, an advantage, for instance, just as there has been a disadvantage in the past, an advantage to being a young black woman. I can think of quite a lot of people whose perceived disadvantages, including women, whose perceived disadvantages have really been an advantage to them. I can think of many women who have been promoted to a position because they know that there is a quota in place and that they are needed. And this isn't to say this is entirely wrong or always wrong, but to deny that this is going on a massive scale underneath the society is foolish.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just are not allowed to talk about it. But what I was particularly interested in, you carry that sort of theme through of misrepresentation, if you like, of the sexual issues in the gay world. And I love that you're talking about the gay world now is presented as being all about cozy couples drinking tea rather than randy men. I mean, that was the era I grew up in the 70s, where there was an enormous amount of talk about gay sexuality and about what was happening in certain parts of the male culture. And
Right.
Of course, what happened is AIDS came along, and we have had this incredible remarketing, the cleaning up the image. Tell me about that.
Well, yes. I mean, I think what's interesting, it's one of the underlying issues I do get into in the book, which is what are the and this is going a level underneath the ones of the identity groups.
Yeah.
What are the deeper substructures of our agreed upon ethics at the moment in our society? One is what I describe as the hardware-software issue, where we are in agreement in our societies. And by the way, this isn't as obvious as it sounds. We are in agreement that you do not criticize people for a hardware issue. That is, for something that they cannot change. We can criticize, we don't particularly, but we can criticize people for software things. That is, things they choose to do. One of the reasons I mention this is because an interesting development of the last half a century in particular is that the LGB bit of LGBT moved from being perceived to be a choice into not being a choice. And I think that's broadly the case. I happen to be gay myself, but I think that's in any case more the case than choice, and I explain some of the reasons why. But nevertheless, what used to be called lifestyle choice, which was erroneously called lifestyle choice, has been so fervently pushed back against that effectively you get to this point where we pretend that we know that being gay is more hardwired than we actually do know. And I think this is very interesting. What's interesting about it, among other things, is the lesson that other people have taken from this. So the trans rights groups are desperately doing a fast version of what gay rights people legitimately, I think, did for some decades, which is to say, why would we choose to make our lives harder than they need to be? Life's already difficult for anyone. I mean, no straight man or woman finds life a total doddle and just gets a partner like that and so on. So why would we make it harder than it need be? The move down the line from there is we have absolutely no say in it, and indeed in the trans one. We may hate what we're having to do to ourselves, but we've got to do it anyway. So deep and basic an instinct it is, and this is a very interesting move. In the examples you give of the shift in your own lifetime of the description of gay males in particular, I think that what has been fascinating has been that yes, there has been a move from perceiving people through one aspect of themselves, that is, for instance, sexual behavior, into perceiving them as effectively a community of people with the same values, which is fascinating, because one of the points, you see, if I can do a shortcut of the point I'd like to make, it's this. If somebody said to you, Bettina, I really like women, and you said, what do you mean? She said, I just think they're great. They're so funny and they're so wise and they're so, you would say, as I would, well, who are you talking about? Who are you talking about? Now, what do you mean just women? If somebody said, Bettina, I just think men, they're just great. They're all so clever and funny and so on. You'd say, well,
I never you're not allowed to say that. You never
would, yes, you particularly wouldn't say that one, but you wouldn't. It's a totally inappropriate way of categorizing humanity, because that isn't to say that men and women don't exist or that it's not a significant thing from birth and one of the major biological determining factors in your life. Nevertheless, we can't sum people up like that. And it's the same thing with race. I mean, who would say, I just think that people from the Far East are just brilliant. I just can't spend enough time with. It's just, but who are you talking about? Why don't you see people as individuals? And it's the same thing with the gay thing. There is a presumption in our age, and it's a political presumption in our age, is that everybody in a particular group, particularly sexual groups or sexes and racial groups, not only has all, because they share one characteristic, then share all of the other characteristics, including things like political choice. We have entered this era where we try to sum people up by one element of their character. And this is exactly the opposite of what the rights movements that of recent decades have sought to do justly, which is to say, do not judge somebody just because they're a woman, or just because they're gay, or just because they're black. See the person in the round. And strangely, the people who have pretended they are continuing that rights progression are the people who are regressing it.
But I just want, coming back to that earlier point, I was talking about the sexuality in the gay world. When you talk about the fact that they managed to, there are these enormous inconsistencies that people won't discuss, such as the gay versus queer issue. We have this massive Sydney grey Mardi Gras, where you have sort of half-naked people whipping each other, and all this stuff, which is extremely sexual, and it's a long way from cozy couples drinking tea. And yet we had this massive campaign around, marriage, what do they call it? Marriage equality, and where the whole emphasis was on no, we all faithful couples, and the sort of inconsistencies intrigue me.
Well, there's masses of inconsistencies, not only in the gay world, of course. I mean, there are plenty of straight people who present themselves in one way and behave in. I think that the interesting thing is that we're unwilling to embrace the complexity. For instance,
that's right.
In the case of the gay world you mentioned, I mentioned, yes, I was really pleased in the gay chapter in this to elucidate something that I'd wanted to say for a long time, which is this difference that I described between gay and queer, that is, between people who happen to be gay and people who think that happening to be gay is merely the first step in a broader socio-cultural war that you are meant to engaged in, for instance, to bring down capitalism. And I didn't get that in the starter pack, but it's a very telling thing, because it shows that there are people who have a broader political project. Now, as it comes to the specific thing of the Mardi Gras thing, for instance, you talk about, I give many examples of this because this was always an issue in the gay rights and gay liberation movement, which was, why is there, as I think Andrew Sullivan said in the book in the 90s, and Bruce Bauer did as well, is, what is it about the March on Washington organized by the gay rights movement in America in the 90s that is so different from Martin Luther King's Great March on Washington? If Martin Luther King's march had included people, as you say, sort of in leather chaps whipping each other or something, it's possible that it would have lost some of its moral force. What is it that means that there's always this embarrassing element of this, embarrassing to many people, not everyone obviously, but that cannot recognize the divide that certainly I think should exist between the public and the private, and between what one might describe as serious political point making and sexual exhibitionism. Why are there so many people who don't know that? That wouldn't be the time for that if there is a time for it, and that gets to a very conflicted thing that has been going on. And it's an example of something, as I say, within people who are gay and people who are straight and the wider community is why do we pretend that it's more straightforward than it actually is? And I think it's exactly the same as the other issues. It's exactly the same thing as with the race issues, with the trans issues, with the men and women issue. We are pretending to be very knowledgeable and certain about things that we aren't certain about. And I think this is, at a deep level, one of the causes of what I describe as this great derangement, which is that we somewhere instinctively know this to be the case. We know that we are repeating untrue memes, and know it because we see it with our own eyes and experience it in our own lives, that things are more complex than we're pretending. And this causes, I think, among other things, and we know this from people who studied a crowd behavior, and particularly behavior of a crowd against people who have gone against the crowd. We know that I'm thinking of René Girard, among others. We know that people are more likely to carry out effectively a punishment beating on a person who has told a truth or done something that the people in the crowd have themselves done or have themselves intuited. If somebody comes to you and says, I believe that the world is a square and it's all, perched on the back of one great big diplodocus, that person will be ignored, but they are no threat to us. A threat occurs when somebody comes along and says something that is true, or true in part, which we know to be the case or fear to be the case, and the crowd acts to shut them down precisely because the person is hovering over what they intuit to be the truth.
Yes, I could give you a lot of examples of that, but I think we're sort of gradually running out of time. But what I want to say, the fact that you call out the trans area as one of the most dangerous in these identity groups, if you like, and the politics of the trans movement, it's just been hair-raising to watch in recent years.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting thing. I'm not flame-throwing in any of this, by the way. I should stress for the viewers, and the chapter on trans isn't an attempt to sort of, make jokes or be mean or anything like that. It's actually a very, if I say so myself, a deep attempt to try to wrestle with the plausible claims that are made, and to try to wrestle them apart from the implausible ones, and to try to come to some reasonable, understanding of this. And that's why I do it, piece by piece, very carefully.
You do a very good job pulling it all apart, I thought.
It's very kind. I thought about it a lot and spoke to an awful lot of people about it. But the bit that concerned me was that, it was being presented. There were things like, and I think let's go straight to the hardest one. The presentation of it as being clear to certain dubiously accredited psychiatrists and others that the select group of people can easily identify trans children, which is a new category, and will then, at great cost, help these children to transition into the opposite sex, which is sort of a doddle, really. That we sort of can move if you're a man but you feel you're a woman, or vice versa. That's okay. You're just in the wrong body, and we'll sort that out. I thought that was the big giveaway to me when I started to notice the ease with which that was presented. And I know from an awful lot of people I've spoken to, how dishonest a thing that is. And when you discover one dishonesty like that, I think you very often find a whole world of dishonesty underneath it. I think that is going on in the trans discussion. I think our society is deranging itself by pretending that people can just sort of shift between the sexes like that, or that sex is a choice.
Or that they'll end up happier. I mean, this essential myth that this argument that the children will end up committing suicide if they aren't allowed to transition and so on, whereas all the good research shows that there is a significant risk of suicide with or without a sex change, that it's extremely difficult for many people, even after a sex change operation, to function well. These operations are often not successful. They have ongoing problems. I mean, if anyone has ever really looked at a penis that's been constructed through surgery, and the problems that arise there, it's just horrific. These people are being sold a pup where they have lifelong health problems afterwards, and very little likelihood of successful relationships. And we are not allowed to talk about that.
Well, I mean, a few people can, but it's extremely dangerous for most people, and the cultural closing down on it means that if you are, I was at an event last night where there was a teacher who had just taught at a state primary school here in the UK, who had lost her job because she had said that she just didn't think that the things that she was being asked to teach children about trans issues was right, or it wasn't true. I think she just questioned it, actually, to tell the truth. And she basically can't teach anymore. And those are the ones, it's because, it's all very well for people like me, writers and people who have platforms. We can do some of it, and those of us who don't really care can do a lot of it. As in, don't care what people say, and my own opinion is good enough for me. I don't need the approbation or praise or anything else of any wider group. But for most people in society, going around most everyday life jobs, actually, this is not possible to question. And I think that there are several things that are wrong with that, if I can say so very quickly. One, and at a deeper level just than the dishonesty that we're being invited to engage in. The first one is, you cannot blackmail a society with suicide. You cannot. You cannot blackmail a society and say, believe what I'm telling you to believe, or I can't promise that I won't harm myself. That is a behavior that certain teenagers will go through with their parents. It's on a wide societal level, as in a personal family relationship, totally impossible to live under that form of blackmail. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you do fall for that and then agree to say the lies, or so the things you sense not to be true or deeply untrue, then there is a risk that you'll be invited to engage in more lies next. And that is a very dangerous thing for any society. I'm worried not just by the current lies, but by the possibility that there are bigger lies we'll be invited to agree to, of almost any kind. They may not have even been come up with yet next. But then there's a third thing, which is worth saying, which is relevant to all of these things, which is this the best thing we should be doing with our time? Ought it to be the case in the 21st century when our ability to connect as we are now around the world, to swap ideas, to swap knowledge, to swap learning, has never been greater, when our ability to access knowledge has never been greater, is it a good use of our time to be discussing female penises? Or
Yep.
is there something better we could be doing? Now, I preempt an obvious critique of this. Well, no one's making you speak about female penises, Bettina and Douglas. Well, in a way, they are, because if we're being made to, those of us who have a low tolerance threshold for lies will have to not agree to that, and we'll have to spend a certain amount of time refuting certain untruths. But there is also the fact that if there are lies you are being expected to agree to, they are indeed distracting for anyone who won't agree to them. And most of us would like to get on or get back to subjects of greater and deeper meaning. And I urge people to contend with this idea, because I urge particularly young people. I'm very, very lucky to have a large, following and readership of people in their late teens and 20s, and really smart people who are, seeing through, the era that they're being invited to engage with. And those people in particular, I want to spend as little time as possible on these things. This is why I wrote The Madness of Crowds. Part was to say, I want to help you get through and over this, so you spend as little time as possible enmeshed in these unwinnable games, in order to get onto the things your competencies have equipped you to get onto, which are going to be the real contributions you make to your age and to your time.
Well, I think that's a very good place to stop, Douglas. I hope a lot of people, particularly young people, are listening to this and taking notice of what you suggest. Thank you very much for talking to me tonight, and all the best with. Do you have another book on the horizon?
I've always got another book on the horizon.
Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing about it.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to meet, and good luck with your own personal landmines.
My own personal madness. Thank you, Douglas.
All the best.
All the best. Thank you. Thanks everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.